Hello and welcome to Late Reviews. My name is Arvid, and today I'll be talking about the original 3 movies in the Evil Dead franchise. I think it's the first time I'm talking about a franchise where 2 of the movies mean a lot to me. I have so fond memories of these movies ever since I first saw them as a child, later teenager, later young adult. With the exception of the first one, I actually hadn't seen these movies for quite a few years. I hadn't really been savoring this. But then I realized that there's a new Evil Dead movie out. So yeah, originally I had not planned on doing a review of the Evil Dead franchise until some distant future, but I guess riding the wave of topicality, I should do it now, which I then did, as you can see. And this review will be quite different from my other reviews. First of all, I didn't watch them alone, I watched them with some other people, meaning that I did get there first, like it was the first experience of the movie. That is one thing that, in a sense, will influence my experience and my review of this. Not too much, though. It's more that I had someone to talk about these things with. I had someone to sometimes catch things that I didn't catch. So issues about the movie, chronological issues, or things that worked. You know, these small details that, even though I'd watched them many times, I might not really have noticed them before or thought about them. So in that sense, you could say that this review is peer-reviewed or semi-peer-reviewed. And also, this is the first franchise I'm doing where I love it so much that I've been watching a lot of behind the scenes. I've been watching documentaries about this before and also some in preparation for this. I will not bring up a lot of these facts, but I do think some of the things are actually relevant to say at times. And also, it just made me think even more about how special these movies are. Because today I'm not going to talk about bad movies. I'm going to talk about good movies. This is so rare for me. That doesn't mean I'm going to talk about perfect movies, because yes, I might love these movies, but there are so many flaws in them, and I'll get into them. But you can actually ignore these plot holes, these inconsistencies, these issues, because the movies are so enjoyable. So the way I'll do these reviews is that I will give you some plot details. I'll try not to spoil it. There will be minor spoilers just because it's difficult to avoid it. Especially, there is one semi-controversial thing I'll be bringing up, and that will involve me talking about spoilers. And then I will also just give me my overall thoughts, my feelings about this, bringing up some things that might work really well and might not work that well. And that's how we'll do this. So without further ado, let's talk about The Evil Dead from 1981. This movie has a very low budget of $300,000. And I think taking that into consideration, what they did with this movie is quite amazing. The plot follows a group of 5 young people going to a cabin in the woods. It's 2 couples. One is Ash Williams, who is essentially our lead protagonist, although this movie actually focuses less just on him and more on the dynamic of the crew, and he has much less agency than he will have in the other movies. And upon arriving at this cabin, they start exploring it, and in the basement they find this weird tome and this recording of this professor talking about how this is a book of pure evil. This is the book of the dead that has the powers to summon evil spirits, to summon pure evil. And in the recording, it does say out the phrase, an incantation that ends up summoning these evil forces that start possessing, harassing, tormenting these young people. And I think that's what I can say about the plot without going into spoilers. It's quite a simple premise, and it's not that the movie is exactly slow, but it does take 20-30 minutes until it kind of starts picking up the flow, and then we do get like a small peak, and then it quiets a bit down and builds up again towards the ending. So Ash Williams in this one is actually a bit of a backseat character. He is a wimp. There is one scene where, he needs to use an axe on something, and he's so terrified that he does get the axe, but once he gets back to the rest of the group, he can't use the axe. He's just holding onto it, just clinging onto it and holding up against his chest, unable to do anything with it. And it takes another member of the group to actually go in, take the axe from him, and then use it. And he's pretty much like that in the whole movie. Ash, until at the very end, he's forced to grow some balls. He's forced to become a hero. He's forced to become a protagonist to survive the situation. And I do like that dynamic. I do like movies with protagonists that actually don't have that much agency. Protagonists in fish out of water situations where they actually don't know what to do, where they're probably as ignorant as mortified, as stunned as you might be in a similar situation. It's not that the movie is comparable in any way to that movie, but a good example of this is in Big Trouble in Little China, where the main protagonist, except at the very, very end of it, he has no real impact on the story. Whenever he tries to do something heroic, he utterly fails, and he has no understanding of this Chinese world he's in. He's along for the ride. So to say, this movie is not so much that Ash is along for the ride, just that for as long as it's possible for him, he will not take responsibility, he will not do anything when he doesn't have to, when someone else is the alpha, when someone else is able to dominate the situation, or at least show some initiative and do something about whatever they're in. I do like that dynamic. It's a good dynamic, but it doesn't feel like Ash Williams. I'll talk about that in the other when talking about the other movies, but this is not Ash Williams as we will know him. This is not Bruce Campbell as we will know him. This is a very young Bruce Campbell. I love that man, and it is interesting to see him playing something completely different than what you're used to see him as. I'll also say that when it comes to the budget, that this movie gives us some really good effects, especially practical effects. This is the movie, I'm not sure if it invented it, but it is very famous for its camera movements through the woods that look very good. It's just pulled off with people who are very passionate about movies and are very innovative, ingenious about how to spend their money well, how to get the best bang for the buck. It's very effective with its camera movement. The stop motion is quite good. It has some nasty effects. Some of the ways they utilize the practical effects, it kind of looks bad by modern standards. But because it's practical, it looks nasty. It's still effective. You might half laugh at it, but you will also probably feel some disgust or uncomfortable about it, or you'll probably understand that this is actually quite for what they had. If you're only used to watching modern movies, this might be disappointing to you, but I do like what they do in this movie. I do like how they create these dolls, how they create these semi-gore effects, because it's not the most bloody movie, but it is a really disgusting movie in some ways. It's not done in ways that look realistic, but it's done in ways that just work. I'm being vague about this, and I guess I don't have to be. I can say this without spoiling. So it shows bodies disintegrating, it shows them decomposing, it shows them partly decomposing, it shows limbs being torn off. It has some quite good effects in that sense, and I do enjoy it. I think it's a bit slow compared to the other movies, and although this is mainly a horror movie, it does have comedic moments. Some of the comedy is unintentional. I think it's unintentional in that it comes from these effects and how they might not age that well and might look cheap because they are cheap. But it also has some banter between the characters. It does have some funny moments, and these evil entities, they are evil. They like to torment people. They don't kill off people as easily as they could because they like to torture them physically and mentally. And I think the final things I'll talk about here is that it does have some, so when I talked about that these movies are definitely not perfect, another issue is that there are a lot of really stupid character decisions here. The ones that are so cliche horror movie that it's unforgivable. It's what you might expect from the genre, but it does end up detracting from your overall enjoyment of the movie, at least in my case. A single vulnerable woman who just had a traumatic experience running into the dark forest to confront something that she thinks she's seen there without getting help from anyone else. That sort of thing. It has people splitting up when they definitely shouldn't split up, and then things happening off screen for that reason. Maybe I wasn't in the right mood when watching it, but it does feel slow. The ending is really good and it's definitely worth the wait. So if you find it so boring that you can't endure it, you can just fast forward and see the ending. There will not be really that much plot you'll miss. So yeah, you can do that. If you really think it's too slow for you, just watch the ending and see some good effects, see some decent acting, see some funny scenes, see some effective scenes. It is suffering from not having a good enough budget and from being made by two people who are still not in the prime of their career. And I think once I start talking about the second film, you'll understand why this might not be worth watching. Or rather that you should maybe watch the second film first and then watch this one if you're curious. And to understand that, let's go ahead and talk about Evil Dead 2 from 1987. Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell are back. This time, They have 10 times the budget of the first film and a lot more experience. So how do they make a sequel to the first film, which has an ending that might suggest that there shouldn't be a sequel, or that if there is a sequel, it would start off in a way that this movie doesn't start off? There's a debate out there if Evil Dead is a sequel or a remake. I don't understand how people can say it's a sequel. This time it's only Ash Williams and his girlfriend going to a cabin in the woods. But if Ash Williams really survived at the end of the first film, why would he go back to a cabin in the woods? And why would they go back to a cabin in the woods that just so happened to be owned by the same professor, listen to the same recordings, read the same book, knowing what will happen as a result? Why would they do that? It really makes no sense. There's no way the events of this film can be following the events of the first film. Honestly, I think the reason they call it Evil Dead 2 is because Evil Dead already had quite a cult status at the time. It was quite a flop when it came out, but it did gather an audience over time. Not a huge audience, but it was a movie that people talked about, hence why they also wanted to make a sequel to this. Or rather, that they wanted to redo this with a bigger budget and, they knew they could do this better than they did the first time. But to sell it, they had to call it Evil Dead 2. I think that's honestly what happened. And one way I can back this up is that in the documentary on how they made Army of Darkness, the third film, Bruce Campbell says that they wanted Army of Darkness to be Evil Dead 2. And Army of Darkness is a direct sequel to how Evil Dead 2 ends. No doubt about it. So using those words, in his mind, Evil Dead 2 is Evil Dead, if that makes sense. I know that this might be something you would comment about in this comment section or somewhere else. I haven't done enough research to really talk about it more. It's just, it is something I have to address, if this is a remake or not. And I will not treat it as a sequel. I will treat it as a remake. Deal with it. So this does rethread most of the plot points of the original film, but its pace is much, much faster. And it does introduce the elements in different ways. And honestly, I think it is an improvement in all ways, except maybe being a bit too stupidly comedic at times. Whereas the first film was a very functional horror movie that had too many cliches, this one just has outright flaws in it that make no sense within the universe it's taking place in. It has a lot of inconsistencies, and I think the first film at least was more consistent than this one. It had you ask fewer questions. If you're an attentive viewer, especially if you watched the movie multiple times and can now start not just enjoying it, but look for these things, pick up on these things. I was being much more attentive than normally I am watching this movie, knowing I would have to do a review of it. Then you can realize how there actually are quite a few flaws. But before going into that, let's talk about the plot and how it is also diverging from the original film. So the film starts off with Ash and Linda, his girlfriend, going to the cabin. It establishes some important plot points about the relationship, some things that will be important later, and it shows how much they are in love. And then, within the first 4 minutes, Ash plays a recording of the professor saying the same incantation as in the previous film. Linda gets possessed, and he immediately has to kill her. That's 5-6 minutes into the movie. Ash Williams is alone in this cabin and is tormented by evil. Later in the film, we will have more characters arriving at the cabin as the daughter of the professor and the son of the professor. They have found some more pages from the Book of the Dead that they will try and translate to get a better understanding of this ancient Sumerian culture. And they do say that these pages are at least 3,000 years old. So it's a very old book. It's written in a language that it's only her and the dad who could read these texts. And they return, try to get to the cabin. I didn't mention this in the first film. This is also a plot hole, in my understanding, or at least one of those things that don't really make sense that you just have to buy into because it's a good movie. Both the first and the second film has the car cross quite big bridge to get to the cabin. In the first film, it's a very shoddily made bridge. In the second film, it's a sturdy iron construction, and it's seemingly the only thing on the other side of the bridge is this cabin, is this dilapidated, worn-down cabin. There's nothing else in the area. It is established there's a walking trail up to the cabin, but that's it. I don't know who built that bridge. Who built a huge bridge just to get to one small cabin in the woods? I do like how they use it, but if you think about it, it really doesn't make sense. It's really silly. But I don't know, it works because this evil entity shows itself capable of destroying the bridge in a really effective visual effect. It's completely shredded, torn. Steel beams almost look like fingers or nails trying to swallow up protagonists. It's a really good visual. It is also, I think it's a map painting, a model and a map painting in the second one. In the first one, they didn't have the money to do that, but in the second film, it looks good. So I don't. It is silly, and I think that's why in the remake they came up with another solution that was more easy to buy. Anyway, so they have to get help from these two. Apparently, there are two people there. I think maybe they're responsible for the bridge or something, and then. But for some reason, they know the trail to the cabin. I guess they just know the area well. So we have 4 people arriving at the cabin somewhere. I think it's 30-40 minutes into the movie. So after that, we have multiple people in the cabin. And there's a good dynamic in this. 4 people showing up to a cabin, and there's this guy inside who, at that time, is not in his best mental or physical state. Plus, the 2 parents are missing. Saying more about the plot would risk spoiling it. There's so much happening in this movie. It is much faster paced. It is much wilder. It's just, honestly, and it's amazing. It's a wild ride. It's a very wild ride. And it all ends with, I will spoil this because, as I said, the ending of this directly leads up to the third film. It ends up with them translating the Sumerian pages to cast the evil back in time to the Middle Ages. And those 2-3 minutes, whatever they should, maybe 5 minutes in the Middle Ages in this one. It is a hilarious idea. It's really nicely put. But the armor that the medieval knights in 1300 AD are wearing, it's so awful. It's so laughably bad that I was very happy to see that in Army of Darkness, they did up the armor game because it looks plain awful. It looks plain awful at the end of Evil Dead 2. One thing that I initially thought of as a plot hole could just be that the plot is not told very well, because so we have established that the book is at least 3,000 years old. Yet there is a moment in the movie where they look at the book and there's this drawing, and Ash feels an immediate connection to the drawing and asks the woman, "What is this?" Professor's daughter says something akin to, it was a prophecy that this man came in 1300 AD. This man rid this medieval Europe of this evil. To me, it sounds like that it is written in the Book of the Dead, that this had occurred, that it was describing past events, not future events, because 1300 AD is not 3,000 years ago. I will maybe give the movie the benefit of the doubt that it was just always meant to be a prophecy about the future written in the past, but that prophecy is then in the past in this film, that it was just never really told in a way where it was a clear message. I did consider this a plot hole. They tried to, with a throw-off line in Army of Darkness, they make it seem like that this was a prophecy in the past about the future, in that Ash Williams is called the Promised One at one point, or maybe at 2 points in Army of Darkness. This is a potential plot hole, and I think even if we don't treat it as a plot hole, it is a part of the movie that could have been better told. And yeah, it has all these inconsistencies, plot holes, or things not told too well. I'll try not to spoil them. If you have seen the movie, you might know what I mean. I think the main inconsistencies in the movie, it's not really established what the evil entity can do. We know it's visible. We know it has a force, a mass, because the protagonist can see it, but we never see it, what it looks like. And actually, I really love that. A problem is that it works in some weird ways. For example, it seems to control day and night. It can fast forward time. It controls the smoke, which I think is a really funny and effectful scene. It really plays well with it. It possesses Ash twice in the movie. And the first time, sunlight seems to cure him, meaning that during the day there should be no problem. And even though it can control day and night, it can't control it completely. And yeah, the second time he's possessed, he gets a memory of his life. And that brings him back. So he's still in there even though he's possessed. So it's not completely the evil entity being in control. There's also sometimes people are possessed for apparently no reason. Something just reached out to them and possessed them. In other scenes, they have to be physically touched by the evil entity or by some other evil entity. It can do all these different things. It can make all these weird objects move and laugh. So there's a scene where something happens while Ash is sitting in a chair. And then after it happens, he's back in the chair and it looks like a dream. But then it's revealed that it wasn't a dream. Or if it was a dream, it was only partly a dream. Some barricades were ruined, and when he's waking up, it's no longer ruined. These powers just, you don't understand when it's messing with his head and when it's doing something for real. And that messes with my head. In that sense, the movie kind of is more effective. You're feeling lost in it, in a sense. The powers can control everything and sometimes nothing. Sometimes limbs can become evil, or limbs of an evil entity can't be alive after being dismembered or cut off. Sometimes it's enough just to kill the evil entity, like in the head or in the chest or in the heart. There are no real rules to this movie. The biggest issue, however, because yes, all of this is just the evil being evil and you just being on for the ride. But the dad who is dead, apparently, the professor, he suddenly appears as an apparition and talks to our protagonists. First of all, how does he break through? How does this work? How can he be there? He's obviously not on the side with evil, so the evil would not allow him. How can he be a ghost or an apparition? And also when he does appear, he does this woo to scare the protagonist. It makes no sense. There's one more thing I would talk about, and this is an issue that I actually do find difficult. It leads to some really funny moments, but it is something that I normally don't like in movies. If something happens out of frame, it happens out of the character's field of vision. Meaning that at one point, someone is surprised in the middle of a room by someone who had to have been at least 4 meters away from the person, and suddenly he's jumped by the person. Almost like the person teleported. We know that the person didn't do that. The distance, the geography didn't matter at all because of that. There's another scene like that. Someone is on the floor. The other person is leaning against a wall. And within 2 seconds, the person on the floor gets up and attacks the person against the wall without the person seeing the other person get up from the floor and react to it. And doesn't hear it either. Those things, in a lesser movie, these things would break it. That's actually what I find weird about this movie. I love it so much. But it has a lot of elements that would actually break it in other ways. Again, as I said, all these things are minor. The movie feels near perfect to me, or maybe even perfect. So it's just these things just have made it even more perfect. This movie probably works because Bruce Campbell is so damn amazing in it. He is absolutely fantastic. He gives an amazing performance. He's a man of action. He's cool. He has one-liners. He's a fantastic character. Actually, Sam Raimi's directing. And not just Sam Raimi's directing, the cinematography, the sound design, the camera work, the special effects, all the models they use, the stop motion, the humor. This movie has so many good elements that, yes, I brought up a lot of flaws, but in the end, this is a perfect or near perfect movie. And where could such a horror comedy masterpiece go from here? I'll tell you where. To the Middle Ages. Meet Evildead. Army of Darkness. 1992. It's a masterful movie that definitely feels like something from the 90s. It's actually much more of a 90s movie than I remember it. Yes, it still has horror elements, but it is a straight-up comedy. Well, it's a straight-up fantasy comedy. It is technically set in medieval England, but it is so in a sword and sorcerer fantasy way, and not a way that tries to be realistic. Whereas you could say that this has so many anachronisms. I will not get into that, because we'll just treat it as a pure fantasy film. And with that out of the way, I guess I should start with the plot. It has Bruce Campbell. He is initially thought of as being a member of a rebel Northern Army, the Scotsmen, as I think they're supposed to be. But he proves himself by killing some deadites, which are people or other entities controlled or possessed by the evil spirit, or the evil. And after proving himself, he becomes admired by these people. They understand that he is actually from the future. He does possess this future technology. He has a chainsaw and a shotgun with him back in time. His car fell back in time as well. They quickly accept him as being this promised one, but he just wants to go home. So the local wizards tell him to go find the Necronomicon, and it's only a path he can take, a path full of evil. And when he gets there, he has to say 3 words, otherwise it won't be safe to pick up the book. And much of this movie is his journey to get to the book. And once that journey is over, because in one of the most comedic scenes of any movie I've ever seen, he completely botches the incantation he has to say when he has to pick up the book. I love that scene. He releases terrible evil. The evil had previously made a clone of him that he had already killed, but releasing this evil, that clone comes back to life and wants revenge and creates an army of undead soldiers. And it all builds up to this big battle at the end between the humans and the undead. And it's amazing. These skeletons, they are hilarious. They have personalities. They are full size, full body size. The amount of work and dedication to the craft that went into this movie, this is one of the best practical effects movies out there. And it blows my mind, having watched the documentary, the scenes where they're fighting the humans, those scenes were shot separately. So they first shot all the movements with the puppets, all the stop motion scenes, and then they afterwards shot all the scenes with the humans fighting them and superimposed them. So the humans didn't actually really know what they were doing. They were choreographed to act, to be told on what to do in certain seconds. There was this countdown they had to react to. And they did it so well. They pulled it off so well that I didn't know until watching the documentary. I thought they were shooting this at the same time. I hadn't thought about how that would have been possible. But yes, that's what I thought. Just because it works so well. This movie is amazing. This is such an enjoyable film. It has so many good lines of dialogue, gimmicks. Honestly, there are some issues with it. I watched the director's cut, which has some extended scenes. It has a lot of what kind of can be considered filler. It's only, I think, 8 minutes longer. But I think all those 8 minutes, maybe aside from the ending scene, detract from the quality of the film rather than add anything to it. As I said, this is a very 90s movie, and I mean that mostly in bad ways. This movie came out 2 years before The Mask, but it has Mask-like gimmicks. It has these long, weird rubber faces. It has a lot of fast motion action, like people shaking their head very quickly, and that changes their facial expression. Weird lines of dialogue that's supposed to be funny, but it isn't. Stupid gags where there's this really, really, really good scene where he's fighting small versions of himself. But that scene has one problem, and that's at one time a bucket lands on his head, and he's slipping on the floor, and then suddenly he is almost falling, but then he ends up standing on his hand and then goes back to like running, slipping on the floor, and it looks too cartoonish. This movie is very, very cartoonish in a way you really only saw in the 90s. You might have some examples from the 80s, but it's really a 90s thing. In some ways, it does remind me of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which I know is a late 80s movie, but these trends really picked up in the 90s. Some of it, yeah, some of the comedy, some of the action, that is the good elements of the 90s, but it does have some of these less, those things that didn't age that well. And it's not because the jokes are racist or sexist or whatever. It's just that the comedy of it didn't age well. The way they pulled it off didn't age that well. Most other things, a lot of the lines of dialogue, as I said, a lot of the action, even though the costume design and especially the hair of people in this movie is quite terrible, it's still functional. It's really not the worst. It has a lot of issues with other things. It has a lot of chronological issues. When they shot the movie, they didn't really know how things would end up looking in different scenes. So you might have, why they expected him to look in one way at that moment in the film, and he didn't. It seems like only, 1 or 2 days passed from the ending of the second film to this film starting. His hair looks at least a month longer than it does in the first film. His scars, his wounds are somewhat healed, semi-scarred. It actually does quite a bad job at establishing passing of time and geography in this movie. You don't know how much time has passed. You don't know. At one point, we are told that the enemy army is 2 days right away. We are not told if it's approaching right away, but in that 2 days, they not only sent a dispatch to the king in the north, convinced the king in the north to help them, and then for the king in the north to gather an army and go to the rescue, they also bring back his car, starts an alchemy set and creates explosives and all these things, all these future technologies, and creates a Mad Max car in what might only be 2 days. They could have easily said they are 10 days away, or said they're 2 days away, but it looks like they have to prepare things. I mean, a lot of this movie is just a bit too stupid for my liking. They could have done much more to establish the geography and a time frame and everything. It feels a bit too lackluster, and knowing how much thought went into all the puppets or the models they built, all these things, it's sad that they seemingly didn't care at all about creating a realistic world in that sense. Or even a semi-realistic, because I'm not saying, there are some people who think that you cannot have realism in a world that is unrealistic or that is fictional, like with monsters and that sort of thing. When I say realism, I mean realism within the reality of that world. Because, they're still riding horses, so the world building is not good. That is a shame, because it is a really, really good movie. But it is full of flaws. Some of the flaws kind of make it funnier. Like when Ash gets the shotgun the first time in the film, it came back from the future with him when he fell into the past. but it's clearly missing from his back, from the shotgun holster in his back. Then suddenly, when he needs it in a scene, it's in his hand. Giving the movie the benefit of the doubt, it could be that while the camera focused on someone else, he went to where he saw the shotgun lying and picked it up. But that's not established in the movie at all. That's just me being generous to the film. And this shotgun is a double-barreled shotgun. He shoots it 3 times without loading the first time it's used. The second time it's used, he shoots it 4 times. It kind of has this loading sound, but there's no way he could have loaded it in the time that passed. The camera doesn't show him loading it. I think it's honestly just an afterthought that they tried to make it realistic, so they had the loading sound. This is what they do in action movies, that the rules of the real life don't apply to movie weapons. But when it's a double-barreled shotgun, it's much easier to count shots. And also, you have no idea how many rounds he brought back from the future, and he just uses them in a lackluster manner in this movie. Like, he wastes them a lot of the time, and it just feels a bit silly. That's another thing that really bothered me in the movie. So yes, he is hero from the future, and there's a montage where he prepares them for war with the undead. There, he shows them how to use a polo arm in combat. How would he have known that? How would he have known? He has no experience in these things. They are medieval fighters. They are soldiers who've been trained to use these weapons, maybe even since they were children. How can a man from the future in 2 days, or even less, teach this group of soldiers to use a weapon they should already know how to use? Some of the other inconsistencies or plot holes was quite easy for me to overlook or justify, but that actually felt outright stupid. I think I have other things to say, but this is already way too long. I do like the movie a lot. I do like it a lot. I'm only focusing on the negatives here because it's very difficult to just, if I would focus on the positive, I would just spend 3 hours saying, oh, that's a good thing that happens in the movie. That's a good thing. I'll just be explaining everything that happens because it's such a good, eventful movie. It's really good. And yeah, I guess that leaves me with a wrap up. These 3 movies are amazing. The first movie is good, but the second movie is so much better. It's one of the best horror movies ever made. It's so much better than the first film that, yes, I can recommend the first film, but maybe watch the second film first. And then if you really like it, watch the first film. Because if you watch the first film first, it might throw you off, and you might think the other movies wouldn't be to your liking. But the other 2 movies are so different from the first movie that, no, you may very well like the other movies without liking the first one. It has some qualities that the other movies don't have. Some of the qualities is its cheapness, but also it does feel much more like a real horror movie. It has a protagonist that's interesting in a different way than protagonists usually are. Yeah, I do like the first one. It's just the second and Army of Darkness are so fantastic that it does pale a bit in comparison. But honestly, just watch these movies and watch them multiple times. That's really, 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 really good. And honestly, I just feel weird that having finally picked a franchise that I really like, I end up talking about these things that I kind of don't like about them. What to do? I don't know. That's just also because I'm trying not to spoil and everything. So it's just, I'm sorry. I love these movies. I don't know if that got through to you from me just picking up on all these small pet peeves, these small issues that really should be ignored, mostly at least. Anyway, I hope you found this useful. If you want to stay up to date with what I'm watching or read my written reviews of these movies, you can check out my profile at Letterboxd called The Robot Quits. Link will be in the description, and, well, maybe I'll see you next time, where I will be talking about evildeadrise. Bye! He was prophesized, oh boy. Prophesized. That's difficult. How do people say this word? Prophesized. 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 Okay. To those of you who listen to this at the end of it, because it's where I will put this, you'll now understand why I phrased it the way I did.